The first thing the visitors noticed was Mara Ellison's hands. They were stained dark blue from her fingertips to the lines of her palms. She stood inside an old tobacco barn surrounded by wooden vats, wet fabric, and the sharp smell of fermented leaves. Outside, 3 black trucks waited beside the gravel road. Their doors carried the logo of one of the largest sustainable clothing companies in the country. 10 months earlier, no one had wanted Mara's crop. Now company executives had flown across the country to inspect it. A man in a gray jacket lifted a strip of fabric from a wooden beam. It had come out of the vat yellow-green. As air touched it, the color changed. Green became turquoise. Turquoise deepened into indigo. The man watched in silence. "So the blue appears after it leaves the vat?" he asked. "It needs oxygen," Mara said. He turned toward the open barn doors. Beyond them, rows of plain green plants covered the hillside. No flowers, no fruit, no grain. Nothing about the field looked valuable. The man opened a folder. "We want exclusive access to your darkest grade," he said. 3 years. Mara did not reach for the contract. "How much do you need?" He named the volume. She looked toward the yard, where workers were unloading baskets of fresh leaves from neighboring farms. A year ago, Mara had harvested alone. Now 14 farms supplied her. "We can meet it," she said. The man studied her. "You're certain?" Mara looked at her hands. "I wasn't the first time." An older woman entered carrying a folded denim jacket. Ruth Bell placed it on the table. The fabric was dark blue but not perfectly uniform. Shadows moved through the folds like water. The company representative ran his hand across the sleeve. "This came from the last batch?" "Field 7, Ruth said. "Harvested 9 days ago." He looked at Mara. "You can trace the dye to a specific field?" "To the field, the harvest date, and the vat." Another truck entered the yard, then another. The representative watched them line up beside the barn. "How many farms did you say?" 14. "And last year?" "None." He closed the folder. "There is one more detail." Mara waited. "The first-year agreement is worth more than $1 million. The barn became quiet. Only the sound of water dripping from the fabric remained. Mara looked past him toward the hillside. The plants moved in the wind, as ordinary as they had looked the day everyone laughed at her. The cooperative had refused to buy them. The grain dealer had no category for them. The bank had warned her that she had wasted her final season. Grant Holloway had said the crop was worth less than the fuel used to grow it. On paper, he had been right. The plants had no recognized market value. Mara had no buyer, no processing system, and less than a year before the bank could take her farm. All she had was one strange clue, a blue stain on her thumb. The company representative placed a pen beside the contract. Mara picked it up. Before signing, she looked at the vats. The value had always been inside the leaves, but it stayed hidden until they were cut, soaked, broken down, and exposed to air. People had called the crop worthless because they had judged it before the transformation. Mara signed her name. Then she looked toward the first commercial truck waiting outside. 10 months earlier, she had driven those same leaves into town in the back of an old pickup. No one had offered her a cent, and when Grant Holloway saw what she had grown, he laughed loud enough for the entire cooperative to hear. 10 months earlier, Mara drove into town with the first harvest stacked beneath a canvas tarp. The leaves had been cut before sunrise. They were still cool when she parked beside the scale at the County Agricultural Cooperative. Farmers waiting with grain trucks turned to look. One man pulled back the tarp. "What is this?" "Indigo," Mara said. He rubbed a leaf between his fingers. "Looks like weeds." A few men laughed. Mara carried one bundle into the office and placed it on the counter. Dale Mercer, the cooperative manager, looked at the stems. "What do you want me to do with this?" "Buy it." "For feed?" "No." "Seed?" "No." "Then who uses it?" "It produces natural blue dye." Dale glanced at the price board behind him. "Corn, soybeans, hay. Nothing for indigo." "We don't have a market for it," he said. "It's still a crop. So are plenty of things nobody buys." The office door opened. Grant Holloway stepped inside. He owned the largest farm in the county and had spent years trying to buy Mara's land. His eyes moved from the bundle to the truck outside. "How much did you plant?" 11 acres. Grant stared at her. "You used 11 acres for leaves no one wants? There is a market. Then where is the buyer?" Mara said nothing. Grant lifted one stem. No grain, no fruit, no feed value. He dropped it onto the counter. "That crop isn't worth the fuel it took to grow it." The farmers outside heard him. Someone laughed again. Mara looked at Dale. "Can you at least weigh it?" He hesitated, then nodded. The truck rolled onto the scale. A worker recorded the weight, but no one unloaded the leaves. No sale, no receipt, only a number written on a scrap of paper. Mara folded it into her pocket. Grant waited beside her truck. "I'll buy the farm," he said. "It isn't for sale. The bank may disagree." Mara stopped. Her father's illness had drained their savings. The last corn crop had failed during the drought. The farm loan was already overdue. Grant knew. He handed her a business card with an offer written on the back. It was barely enough to cover the debt. "You walk away clean," he said, "and you add my field to yours. It borders my land." Mara tore the card in half. Grant watched the pieces fall. Pride doesn't make land profitable. She climbed into the truck and drove away. By noon, the story had reached town. At the fuel station, someone asked whether the crop was for decoration. At the hardware store, two men stopped talking when Mara entered. By evening, people were calling her property the Weed Farm. Mara returned home with the same leaves she had brought to town. The field stretched behind the house in dense green rows. The plants looked healthy. That no longer mattered. A crop without a buyer was only an expense. Inside the truck, an envelope from the bank lay on the passenger seat. The overdue balance had to be paid before the end of the season. After that, foreclosure could begin. Mara carried the harvest into the barn and spread the bundles across the floor. The leaves were already wilting. She picked one up. There was nothing blue about it, only green. She crushed it between her fingers and threw it onto the pile. Grant's words returned. Worthless. Mara reached for another bundle. Then she noticed a mark on her thumb. At first it looked like dirt. She rubbed it. The stain remained. Green darkened to gray. Then gray became blue. Mara moved closer to the window. The mark was small, no larger than a coin. She crushed another leaf. The same color appeared. Then another. Blue spread across her fingertips. Mara stared at her hand. The cooperative had judged the crop by the leaves. Grant had judged it by weight, but neither of them had seen what happened after the plant was broken open. The value was there, hidden somewhere inside the green. Mara looked at the thousands of harvested leaves covering the barn floor. She had no buyer, no process, and no idea how to extract the color. But for the first time that day, she had proof that the field held something no one else had noticed. Mara spent the next hour testing leaves. She crushed them, boiled them, soaked them in jars. Nothing worked. The boiled leaves turned brown. The soaked water became cloudy. A strip of white cloth came out pale yellow, then dried almost colorless. Only her fingers stayed blue. By nightfall, the barn smelled like wet grass. Mara carried the failed jars into the farmhouse and set them beside the bank letter. On the refrigerator was an old photograph. Mara was 8 years old, standing beside her grandmother Evelyn. Both of them had blue hands. She took the photograph down. On the back, Evelyn had written, "First Dye Day, August 1997. Mara remembered a small garden behind the smokehouse. She remembered baskets of leaves and cloth hanging from the porch, but she could not remember how her grandmother had turned the plants into dye. Most of Evelyn's belongings were still in the attic. Mara pulled down the folding ladder and climbed up with a flashlight. She searched through boxes of clothes, seed catalogs, and tax records. Nothing. At the far wall stood an old cedar chest. Inside were quilts, wooden spindles, and several pieces of faded blue cloth. Beneath them lay 3 notebooks tied with string. The first held household expenses. The second contained sewing patterns. The third was filled with planting dates and rough drawings of barrels. Mara turned the pages quickly. Cut before flowering. Use fresh leaves. Warm water, never boiling. Then, one sentence stopped her. The leaf holds no blue until you teach it how to breathe. Mara read it again. On the next page, Evelyn had written, green in the field, yellow in the vat, blue in the air. Mara carried the notebook downstairs. One jar from her earlier test still held yellow-green liquid. She poured it through a cloth into a metal basin. No blue appeared. She almost threw it away. Then she remembered the word breathe. Mara took a wooden spoon and lifted the liquid into the air. It splashed back into the basin. She did it again. And again. Small bubbles formed on the surface. At first, they were white. Then a thin blue line appeared around the foam. Mara stopped. She stirred faster. Air entered the liquid. The foam changed from white to pale turquoise. It was weak, unstable, but it was blue. Mara dipped 2 fingers into the basin. They came out yellow-green. Seconds later, the color darkened on her skin. A voice came from the porch. "You found Evelyn's notebook." Mara turned. Ruth Bell stood in the doorway carrying a covered dish. She had lived near the farm for most of her life and had known Mara's grandmother well. "You knew about this?" Mara asked. "I knew she may die. Do you know how?" "Some of it." Mara showed her the basin. Ruth examined the foam. Too weak. But it worked. Once, "I need it to work again." Ruth opened the notebook and studied Evelyn's drawings. "Your grandmother used small batches. She watched everything. I planted 11 acres. That means you can ruin more leaves at once." Mara ignored the warning. "Can you help me make 1 piece of blue cloth?" Ruth looked at the bank letter on the table. "This is about saving the farm. It's about proving the crop has value." They worked until dawn. The first test turned gray. The second washed out. The third stained the cloth green. Then Mara pulled a narrow strip of cotton from the final basin. It came out yellow. They carried it outside. The morning air touched the wet fabric. Yellow became green. Green slowly became blue. The color was pale and uneven. Ruth held the strip toward the light. "This is not a product." Mara looked at the blue cloth, then at the field beyond the porch. "No," she said, "but it is proof." Ruth placed the strip on the table. "Proof won't pay the bank." Mara opened Evelyn's notebook to a blank page. "Then we make it repeatable." Lena Price arrived the next afternoon with 2 bundles of cream-colored wool. She owned a small weaving studio 20 miles north of town and had been hired to make a shawl for a regional craft exhibition. Before entering the barn, she stopped beside the blue cloth hanging behind the farmhouse. "You made this from those plants?" she asked. "Yes." "No synthetic dye?" "No." Lena lifted one edge toward the sun. The color was uneven, darker in the folds, lighter along the center. "Can you make this shade again?" Mara hesitated. "I can make something close." "That means no. It means I've repeated it 3 times, not 30. Lena looked across the field. "How much did you plant?" 11 acres. "And you're still working with buckets?" "For now." Lena gave a small nod. "At least you're honest." Inside the barn, Mara had prepared 3 labeled batches. Each came from leaves harvested at a different time. Ruth placed 1 small bundle of wool beside the first basin. "Start with a test," she said. Mara lowered the wool into the liquid. When she lifted it, the fibers looked yellow-green. Lena frowned. "Wait," Mara said. They carried the wool outside. Within seconds, the color changed. Green became turquoise. Then blue. Lena stepped closer. "It changes in the air." "Yes." Mara dipped the wool again. The second exposure made the shade deeper. After the third dip, the fibers had turned a soft indigo. Lena examined them carefully. Several sections were darker than the rest. "This isn't uniform," she said. Mara's stomach tightened. "I can try another batch. You might ruin the wool. I'll replace it. This wool cost more than your equipment." Mara said nothing. Lena carried the bundle into the sunlight and turned it slowly. The variations looked like shadows moving across water. "How well does the color hold?" Lena asked. "I've rinsed cotton, not wool." They filled a basin with clean water. The first rinse turned pale blue. The second was clearer. Most of the color remained in the fibers. Lena pressed the wool between two white towels. Only a faint mark transferred. "This is usable," she said. Mara looked at her. "You'll take it? If you can dye the rest like this." They processed the remaining wool in 2 small batches. Mara followed her notes exactly. Fresh leaves, warm water, controlled air. No shortcuts. The second bundle came out slightly lighter than the first. Mara expected Lena to reject it. Instead, Lena placed the shades side by side. "The shawl is supposed to represent the landscape," she said. "These differences may help." By sunset, the wool hung from a line inside the barn. Lena inspected every section. "How much?" she asked. Mara had calculated the cost of leaves, water, fuel, and time. She still did not know how to price knowledge. $40. Lena opened her wallet and placed 4 $20 bills on the table. Mara stared at them. "I said 40. And 40 would barely cover your labor. This was a test. It was still work." Mara picked up the money. $80 would not save the farm. It would not repair the barn or satisfy the bank. But it was the first money anyone had paid for the crop. At the cooperative, the leaves had been worth nothing. After processing, a small portion had earned $80. Mara opened her ledger. Customer, Lena Price. Product, natural indigo dyeing. Payment, $80. Ruth read the entry. "You didn't sell the leaves." "No." "What did you sell?" Mara looked at the blue wool. "The transformation." Before leaving, Lena wrote 3 names on a piece of paper. "A fabric artist, a leather worker, and a woman who makes custom denim," she said. "They may test your dye." "Why are you helping me?" "Large suppliers sell consistency. Small producers have to sell something different." Lena packed the wool into her car. "If this shawl is accepted, I'll need more." After she left, Mara spread her notes across the kitchen table. A small batch had earned $80. If she could repeat it, the crop might cover the bank payment, but buckets would never produce enough. She needed larger vats, stronger pumps, and more buyers. The total cost exceeded the money she had left. Mara placed Lena's payment beside the bank letter. Then she wrote 2 words on a blank page, "Scale carefully." The next morning she drove to the farm supply store. She returned with the largest used tanks she could afford. By evening they stood inside the barn. Ruth looked at them. "You've controlled a bucket, I know. These aren't buckets." Mara looked toward the field. The bank deadline was approaching. Small batches had proven the idea. Now she had to find out whether the process could survive becoming a business. Mara began with 6 jars. Each held the same weight of leaves. Only one thing changed in each test: water temperature, soaking time, harvest hour, amount of air. She labeled every jar and cut 6 identical strips of cotton. Ruth watched from the barn doorway. "You're treating leaves like evidence." "They are." For 3 days, most of the tests failed. Boiling destroyed the color. Wilted leaves produced weak gray stains. Leaves cut late in the day gave less blue than those harvested before sunrise. The best liquid never looked blue. It remained yellow-green until Mara lifted it into the air. That was the hardest part to trust. On the 4th morning, she cut fresh leaves from the shaded row near the stone wall. She weighed them, submerged them in warm water, and followed the timing written in Evelyn's notebook. When the liquid was ready, Mara strained it into a clean basin. It looked useless. Ruth dipped the cotton. The strip emerged yellow. They carried it outside. Air touched the wet fibers. Yellow became green. Green became blue. Mara compared it with the strip from the day before. The shades nearly matched. She repeated the process. A 3rd strip turned the same blue. Mara pinned all 3 to the barn wall. "That's it," she said. Ruth examined them closely. "They're close. Close means I can control it. Close means you may be learning." Mara prepared a larger batch. Not a tank, a bucket. She refused to scale beyond what she could measure. The leaves were cut before sunrise and processed immediately. She recorded every temperature and every minute. By noon, she had enough liquid to dye a full yard of cotton. Ruth brought an old piece of white fabric from home. "If this fails?" Mara asked. I continue living without new curtains. They lowered the cloth into the basin. When they pulled it out, it looked pale yellow. Outside, blue spread across the folds. The shade was not perfectly even. Dark lines formed where the cloth had creased. Mara studied them. A factory would reject this. Ruth touched the fabric. A factory didn't make it. They rinsed the cloth twice. Most of the color held. That evening, Mara hung it behind the farmhouse. A truck slowed on the road. The driver leaned toward the window to look. Later, two neighbors called Ruth to ask where the fabric had come from. They think it was imported, Ruth said. It came from a bucket. They're looking at the result, not the bucket. Mara returned to the barn and calculated the leaves used in the batch. At the cooperative, the same amount of raw crop had no price. Processed into stable color, it might. That was the shift. She did not need someone to buy the leaves. She needed someone to buy what the leaves could become. Mara wrote a list on the wall. Fresh leaves, morning harvest, warm water, controlled air, small batches. Then she added one final line, find a buyer. The phone rang inside the house. Mara answered. A woman introduced herself as Lena Price, owner of a weaving studio 20 miles away. Ruth told me about your blue cloth, Lena said. Mara looked through the window at the fabric moving on the line. I'm still testing. I have 2 pounds of wool that need a natural blue. How soon? Tomorrow. Mara glanced at the 3 matching samples pinned inside the barn. The process had worked 3 times. That did not mean it would work for a customer, but the bank deadline was getting closer. Bring the wool, she said. After the call, Ruth looked at her. Are you ready? No. Good. Why is that good? Because people who think they're ready stop paying attention. Mara returned to the barn. She removed the darkest sample from the wall and held it toward the light. Tomorrow someone would decide whether the color was beautiful enough to buy. For the first time, the crop would face a market that understood what it was meant to become. The first large batch began before sunrise. Mara filled the new tanks with fresh leaves and warm water. She recorded the weight, temperature, and harvest time exactly as she had with the buckets. For several hours, everything looked normal. The liquid turned yellow-green. A thin foam formed across the surface. Mara switched on the borrowed pump. Air rushed into the first tank. Blue appeared along the foam. It's working, she said. Then the hose broke loose. Liquid sprayed across the barn wall. Ruth shut off the pump while Mara secured the clamp. When they started again, the foam rose too fast. It spilled over the rim and covered the floor. Mara reduced the airflow. The blue disappeared. She increased it. The tank nearly overflowed again. The large vats did not behave like the buckets. The liquid near the surface received too much air. The bottom remained still. The center stayed warm while the sides cooled. Leaves packed together and began to rot. By evening, the smell changed. Not earthy, sour. Ruth leaned over the first tank. We should stop. If we stop, we lose everything. We may have already lost it. Mara dipped a strip of cotton into the liquid. It came out yellow-brown. Outside, it changed to gray. Only a few weak blue patches appeared. She tried the second vat. The color was even paler. The third produced almost nothing. Mara checked her notes. The third tank contained the tallest plants from the lower field. They had looked like the best part of the crop. Now she understood the mistake. More leaves did not always mean more color. Many of those plants had already begun to flower. Their weight had increased. Their useful pigment had not. She tried to save the first 2 vats. They worked until midnight, filtering liquid and moving the pump between tanks. Then rain began hitting the roof. Water entered through a leak near the west wall. Mara placed buckets beneath it. The rain became heavier. A wooden support under the largest tank cracked. Ruth heard it first. Mara. The platform collapsed. The tank tilted and overturned. Hundreds of gallons rushed across the floor. The water knocked over tools, baskets, and drying racks. Blue-gray liquid poured through the barn doors into the yard. Mara stood ankle-deep in the ruined batch. "Turn off the power," Ruth shouted. Mara cut the breaker. They pushed straw bales across the doorway to keep the liquid from reaching the drainage ditch. By dawn, the rain had stopped. The tank lay on its side. Leaves covered the floor. Most of the week's harvest was gone. A truck slowed on the road. Grant Holloway sat behind the wheel. He looked at the flooded barn and raised his phone. Mara saw him take a photograph. He drove away without speaking. By noon, the picture had spread through town. Someone added a caption, "Mara Ellison's $1 million weed business." Then the bank called. "We've received concerns about damage to the property," the loan officer said. "It was an accident. Has it affected your ability to make the next payment?" Mara looked at the ruined equipment. Yes. The officer gave her 30 days. Not until the end of the season. 30 days. After the call, Mara sat on the barn step. The first sale had proven the dye could make money. The ruined vats proved she could not yet produce it at scale. A car entered the driveway. Lena stepped out carrying the finished shawl. The wool was layered blue, dark at the edges and pale through the center. "The exhibition accepted it," Lena said. "They want 3 more." Mara looked at the destroyed barn. "I can't promise another batch." Lena removed a small strip of dyed fabric from her bag. One edge had faded after several days in her studio window. "If the next batch does this, I can't use it." Mara touched the pale section. The color had looked stable. It was not stable enough. A buyer did not need one successful accident. A buyer needed the same result again. Mara stood. Ruth looked at her. "What are you doing?" "Starting over." "With what money?" Mara picked up the faded strip. "Not with money." She looked toward the field. "With the leaves." The large tanks had failed because Mara had tried to multiply a process she did not fully understand. This time, she would stop measuring success by volume. She would learn which leaves produced the strongest color, when to cut them, and why some batches held while others faded. The field was still there, but now Mara had only 30 days to learn how to read it. Before sunrise, Mara entered the field with 6 cloth bags and a notebook. She collected leaves from different sections, young growth near the stone wall, mature plants from the lower field, leaves cut in shade, leaves exposed to afternoon heat. Each bag received a label. Back in the barn, she tested them under the same conditions, same weight, same water temperature, same soaking time, same amount of air. Only the leaves changed. By noon, the results were clear. Young leaves cut early produced the strongest blue. Wilted leaves created weak gray stains. Plants already beginning to flower gave more weight, but less usable color. The shaded row near the stone wall produced the darkest batch. Mara looked at the samples. She had treated 11 acres as one uniform crop. It was not. Ruth entered carrying coffee. "You found the problem?" "Several problems." Mara showed her the labels. "I mixed strong leaves with weak ones, fresh leaves with wilted ones, young growth with flowering plants, and then filled the largest tank you could find." Mara nodded. "I measured volume. I should have measured quality." For the next week, she changed the harvest system. Leaves were cut before the heat. Each section remained separate. Anything wilted was rejected. Flowering plants were marked for later testing. Instead of one large vat, Mara used several smaller containers she could control. Every batch received a number. Every result was pinned to the barn wall. At first, the wall showed failure: pale blue, gray blue, uneven blue. Then the samples began to match. 3 batches in a row dried into nearly the same shade. Mara placed them side by side. "That's repeatable," she said. Ruth examined the fabric. "It's close. Close is enough to improve." The 4th batch failed. Its color came out thin. Mara checked the record. The leaves had remained in the truck for nearly 2 hours before processing. She drew a line beneath the entry. Maximum delivery time, 1 hour. The next batch held. Mara added another rule: process immediately. The system became simple: cut early, separate the leaves, weigh every batch, control the temperature, control the air, keep every sample. Nothing entered a vat without a record. Nothing failed without a reason. Lena returned 10 days after the accident. She brought 3 bundles of wool and the faded test strip. "Can you make the next color hold?" she asked. Mara handed her one of the new samples. Lena bent it beneath the light. "How many washes?" "6. Sun exposure? 5 days." Lena rubbed it against a white cloth. Almost nothing transferred. "And you repeated it?" Mara pointed toward the wall. 3 times. Lena placed the wool on the table. "Then prove it again." Mara processed the first bundle. The wool emerged yellow-green. Outside it turned blue. The second bundle matched. So did the third. Lena inspected the dried fibers. No pale edges, no gray patches, no major difference between batches. She placed an envelope on the table. Inside was a deposit of $240. Mara entered it into the ledger. The first payment had rewarded possibility. This one rewarded reliability. Lena looked at the wall of samples. "You kept every failure. I need to recognize them early. That may matter more than the successful pieces." After Lena left, Mara walked to the shaded row near the stone wall. Its leaves were smaller than those in the lower field, but darker and cooler beneath her fingers. She harvested one controlled batch. The result was deeper than anything she had produced before. A rich indigo formed across the cloth. Ruth held it beside the other samples. "This is different." Mara checked the label. "North wall. Early harvest. Young growth. Can you make more?" "If the rest of the row behaves the same." The next morning, Mara processed another batch from the same section. The shade matched. For the first time, the field had produced more than a stable color. It had produced a premium one. The phone rang that afternoon. A regional exhibition curator had seen Lena's shawl. A designer wanted enough natural indigo for a silk dress. "She wants to visit the farm first," the curator said. Mara looked around the barn. The roof was patched. The equipment was second-hand. Blue stains still marked the floor from the collapsed tank. The dye was finally ready to be judged. The business was not. "When is she coming?" Mara asked. "Tomorrow." Mara looked at the dark sample from the north wall. "Tell her to bring the dress." The designer arrived the next morning. Her name was Elise Warren. She stepped from a rented car carrying a white silk dress. 2 people followed her with cameras. Mara looked at Ruth. No one mentioned filming. "Elise documents her work," Ruth said. Elise entered the barn and studied the samples pinned to the wall. Her attention stopped on the darkest blue. "This one. It came from the shaded row near the north wall," Mara said. "Can you make enough for the dress?" "I can make the color. I can't promise every fold will match. I don't want perfect." Elise placed the dress on the work table. The silk was plain, pale, and expensive. One bad vat could ruin it. Mara cut 3 small test pieces from the same fabric. The first absorbed too much color. The second dried green. On the third, Mara shortened the dip and allowed more time between exposures. The silk came out yellow-green. Then the air turned it blue. Elise held the sample beside the dress. "Use that process." Before sunrise the next day, Mara harvested the north wall leaves. She rejected anything wilted. Every bundle went into the vat within an hour. When the liquid was ready, Mara lowered the dress slowly. The silk disappeared beneath the surface. After several minutes, she and Ruth lifted it out. The dress looked yellow. One cameraman moved closer. Elise said nothing. Mara carried the fabric outside. The change began near the shoulders. Yellow became green, green became turquoise. Then blue spread through the folds. The camera crew stopped moving. They watched the color deepen in the open air. "It still needs another dip," Mara said. They repeated the process twice. Each exposure made the dress darker. By the final dip, the folds had become deep indigo while the raised areas remained lighter. The color was uneven, but the variation followed the shape of the fabric. Elise walked around it. No machine could make this exact dress twice. "No," Mara said. "Good." The crew filmed the green plants, the yellow liquid, and Mara's stained hands. That evening, Elise posted a short video. It showed the white dress entering the vat. Then it showed the fabric changing color outside. The caption read, "This blue was grown, not manufactured." By morning, Mara had 12 missed calls. A boutique wanted scarves, a photographer wanted fabric, a denim maker asked for samples. People kept sending the same question: how does a green leaf become blue? The video spread because the transformation happened in front of the viewer. Nothing was hidden. The crop looked ordinary. The liquid looked wrong. Then the air revealed the value. By noon, Mara's order list covered the kitchen table. Ruth looked at the messages. "This is what you needed." "No," Mara said. "This is more than I can produce." Attention did not solve her problem. It made the problem larger. Most buyers wanted delivery dates. Some wanted quantities Mara could not make in a month. One email came from a national denim company. They requested a video call that afternoon. 3 representatives appeared on Mara's laptop screen. They asked about color consistency, production volume, water use, and harvest records. Mara answered honestly. She had completed 4 paid orders. She worked with small vats. She could trace each batch to a section of her own field. One representative held up a printed image of Elise's dress. "We're developing a limited natural dye collection," he said. "We want to inspect your operation." "When?" "Next week." Mara looked toward the barn. The roof was patched. The vats were second-hand. The processing floor still carried stains from the accident, but refusing the visit would end the opportunity. "You can come," she said. After the call, Ruth began sorting the order requests. "A large company came to you. They came because of a video. They came because the dye worked. They'll leave if the business doesn't." Outside, several cars had stopped near the gate. People stepped out holding cameras and pieces of white cloth. For the first time, Mara did not need to prove that the crop had value. She needed to prove she could supply it, and a beautiful dress was not enough. The denim company arrived in 2 black vehicles. 4 representatives stepped into the yard. Daniel Reed led the team. He managed material sourcing. With him were a textile chemist, a sustainability officer, and a production manager. They began in the field. "How many acres are ready?" Daniel asked. 7, Mara said. "The rest are regrowing. How much dye can that produce?" Mara gave him her estimate. The production manager entered it into a tablet. "We would need 12 times that amount." "For a full collection?" "For a limited one." They moved into the barn. Daniel examined the second-hand vats and repaired pump. The chemist studied the samples pinned to the wall. "These 5 are recent?" "Yes." He placed them side by side. The shades were close, but not identical. "Our customers expect consistency," Daniel said. "This is a natural dye," Mara replied. "Some variation is part of it." "Variation is acceptable," the chemist said. "Uncontrolled variation is not." Mara showed them her records. Every sample had a harvest section, cutting time, temperature, and batch number. The chemist stopped at the darkest cloth. "This came from one part of the field, the shaded row near the north wall. Can you produce it again?" "I already have." "Can you produce 1,000 yards of it?" Mara did not answer. They inspected the water system next. Mara reused part of each batch, but she had no formal wastewater plan. She had no laboratory testing, no product liability insurance, no employees under contract, no backup processing site. Each missing item went onto the production manager's tablet. Finally, Mara prepared a demonstration. She lowered a strip of denim into the vat. It came out yellow-green. Outside, the fabric turned blue. The chemist watched the shade deepen. "The color is excellent," he said. It was the first clear approval all day. Daniel lifted the cloth. "How many yards can you produce at this quality each week?" Mara told him. The production manager looked at his screen. "It isn't enough. I can add more vats." "With what capital?" Mara said nothing. Daniel placed the sample on the table. "The product is promising, but we cannot sign a supply contract." The words landed harder than the laughter at the cooperative. That day, Mara had proven the crop had value. She had failed to prove the business could deliver it. What would have to change, she asked. Daniel listed the requirements: more capacity, independent color testing, formal water management, insurance, reliable labor, traceability for every batch, a backup plan if the crop failed. "How long would that take?" Mara asked. "Months. I have less than 3 weeks." Daniel looked at her. For what? The bank. He closed his folder. That is not something we can solve. Before leaving, he handed her a card. If you build the system, call me. You think I can? I think the die is ready. Daniel looked around the barn. The business isn't. The vehicles disappeared down the road. Mara remained beside the sample wall. The company had praised the color and purchased nothing. A truck stopped near the house. Grant stepped out carrying a folder. I saw them leave, he said. Mara kept walking. No contract? No. He held out a purchase agreement. The offer was high enough to clear her debt. You have until tomorrow, he said. Mara opened the folder. Grant wanted the land before the bank took it. He no longer mentioned the crop. He assumed it had already failed. Mara carried the agreement into the barn. On the table lay Daniel's list of requirements. Capacity, labor, traceability, backup fields. Every requirement assumed Mara had to grow all the leaves herself. She looked through the open doors. Beyond her property were small farms with unused fields. Some had lost money on corn, some lacked machinery, others were too small for the commodity market to notice. Mara pulled out a county map. She marked the first empty field, then another. By midnight, 14 properties were circled. She did not need to buy more land. She needed other farmers. Grant wanted an answer the next morning. Instead, Mara filled her truck with seed, sample cloth, and supply agreements. Before sunrise, she drove to the first abandoned field. Mara reached Amos Reed's farm before sunrise. His tractor had not moved in 2 years. Half the lower field was covered in weeds. She placed a sack of indigo seed on his porch. You want me to grow this? Amos asked. Yes. Who buys it? I do. He studied the blue cloth in her hand. And if your buyer disappears, that risk is mine. Mara handed him a 1-page agreement. She would provide seed and instructions. Amos would deliver fresh leaves within 1 hour of cutting. She would pay for every accepted pound. The price was higher than what his last corn crop had earned. Amos read the agreement again. How much should I plant? Half an acre. That won't save your farm. No, but 5 farms might. Amos signed. By noon, Mara had 2 more growers. Rosa Delgado agreed to plant an unused field behind her house. 2 elderly sisters offered the ground beside their abandoned orchard. Others refused. One farmer called the plan a scam. Another said Grant had warned them not to join. Mara did not argue. She showed each person the cloth, the sales ledger, and the denim company's requirements. She made no promises of wealth, only a guaranteed price for leaves that met the standard. Within 2 days, 5 farms had joined. Together, they offered 6 additional acres. It was still not enough for the company's original order. But Mara was no longer the only grower. She invited the farmers to her barn. On the work table she placed 4 bundles of leaves, fresh young growth, wilted leaves, flowering stems, leaves cut in afternoon heat. Beside them lay 4 cloth samples, dark blue, pale blue, gray, faded. All of these came from Indigo, Mara said. The difference begins before the leaves reach the vat. She showed them how to harvest before the heat, keep the bundles shaded, and record the cutting time. Every farm received a code. Every delivery would be weighed and tracked separately. If a batch fails, Rosa asked, you'll know where it came from? Yes. And if one produces better color? We'll know that too. Mara called the new group the Ellison Indigo Growers Cooperative. Its headquarters was still a damaged barn. Its records fit inside one binder. But it had what Mara lacked during the company inspection: more land, more labor, backup fields. Traceability, she called Daniel Reed. I solved part of the capacity problem, she said. How? 5 farms signed grower agreements. That still isn't enough volume. It is enough for a pilot. Daniel remained silent. Mara continued. Each field has a code. Every delivery includes harvest time and leaf condition. If one farm fails, the others keep producing. You built a grower network? Yes. In 2 days? It's small. So is your processing system. Then test both. Mara proposed a paid pilot using leaves from several farms. The company would accept the dye only if it passed color and wash tests. Daniel requested the records. An answer arrived the next morning. Pilot approved. The first cooperative harvest began before dawn. Amos delivered his leaves 28 minutes after cutting. They were fresh, cool, and labeled. His batch produced a clean medium blue. Rosa's shaded field created a brighter shade. The orchard plot produced less weight but stronger color than expected. Mara kept every lot separate. The system worked until Ben Carter arrived with a truck full of wilted leaves. "They were cut this morning," he said. "How long ago?" 3 hours. Mara examined the bundles. The leaves were warm and soft. "I can't accept them." Ben stared at her. "You asked me to grow this crop, and the agreement required delivery within 1 hour. You know what it costs to harvest? If I mix these into a good batch, we could lose all of it." Ben threw the agreement onto the table. "You're no better than the cooperative. The cooperative rejected the crop without testing it. I'm rejecting this delivery because I already know what it will do." Ben drove away with the leaves. The other growers watched in silence. The next week he returned 40 minutes after cutting. Mara accepted the entire load. The lesson spread quickly. Freshness was not a suggestion. It was part of the product. At the end of the pilot, Mara laid 6 denim samples across the work table. Each carried a field code. Daniel returned with the textile chemist. Mara pointed to the first sample. "Amos Reed's lower field. Morning harvest." Then the second. "Rosa Delgado's east plot. More shade." She touched the darkest cloth. "My north wall row." The chemist compared the records. "The shades vary. They're traceable. Can you combine them to reach a target color?" "Yes." "Or keep them separate as limited lots?" Daniel lifted one sample. "You could link each garment to the farm that grew the dye. With the grower's permission." The chemist tested the fabric. Wash resistance passed. Color transfer stayed within range. The darkest batch met the premium target. Daniel closed the report. "The pilot works." Mara waited. "We can discuss a limited commercial order." He named the volume. It was smaller than the original proposal but large enough to pay the growers and improve the barn. It was not enough to clear Mara's debt before the deadline. "When would payment arrive?" she asked. "After delivery. The bank deadline is 3 days away." Daniel's expression did not change. "We cannot pay for material you haven't produced." Mara looked toward the growers outside. They had built the system the company demanded, but the farm could still be lost before the first commercial order entered a vat. Ruth approached with an envelope. "A courier brought this." The return address belonged to the denim company. Inside was a second proposal. Not an order. An investment. The company was willing to fund new equipment, testing, and expanded production. In return, it wanted part ownership of Mara's business. The crop had finally become valuable enough to save the farm. Now Mara had to decide how much of it she was willing to give away. Mara read the investment proposal at the kitchen table. The denim company would fund new vats, water systems, laboratory testing, and the first commercial harvest. In return, it wanted 25% of the processing business and priority access to the darkest indigo grade. The amount was large enough to stop the foreclosure. It was also large enough to change who controlled what Mara had built. Ruth sat across from her. "What happens if you refuse?" "The bank takes the farm." "And if you accept?" "I keep the farm, but the company owns part of the business." Ruth looked at the proposal. "Then don't argue about whether they get a share. Argue about what that share allows them to control." Daniel Reed returned to the barn that afternoon. Mara placed the proposal on the table. "The growers keep their land," she said. "They do. The company cannot force them to sell only to you. We only want priority on the premium grade. No additional shares without approval from me and the Cooperative Council." Daniel read the change. "Our legal team may reject that. Then there is no agreement. The bank deadline is tomorrow." "I know." Daniel watched her for a moment, then stepped outside to make a call. The growers waited in the yard. None of them spoke. 20 minutes later, Daniel returned. "The council provision stays," he said. Mara added one more condition. A grower could not be removed after one failed harvest. The farmer would receive test results and a chance to correct the problem. Daniel accepted. Then he placed a second document beside the investment agreement, a 3-year purchase contract. The company guaranteed a minimum annual order. Premium dark indigo received the highest price. Lighter batches would be used for limited garments instead of being rejected. Mara read the total projected value: equipment, investment, guaranteed purchases, existing orders, company valuation. Together, they exceeded $1 million. "This isn't one payment," she said. "No," Daniel replied. "It is the value of the business once the agreements take effect. And they take effect only if the first commercial batch passes testing." "Yes." Mara looked toward the field. The crop had moved from worthless to valuable on paper, but the final proof still had to come from the vats. She signed. Daniel signed after her. The growers added their names to the cooperative schedule. The denim company issued an advance against the first order. That afternoon, Mara carried the documents to the bank. The loan officer reviewed them twice. "This payment is tied to delivery. So are most farm loans," Mara said. He called a supervisor. Mara waited with blue stains still visible beneath her nails. When he returned, he placed the foreclosure notice in a folder. "The action is suspended. Once the advance clears, the account will be current." Mara nodded. The bank had not changed its opinion of the crop. It had changed its opinion of the contract. That was enough. The first commercial harvest began before sunrise the next morning. Trucks arrived from every cooperative field. Amos delivered first. Rosa followed with 2 labeled loads. Ben arrived 40 minutes after cutting, his leaves cool beneath wet cloth. Each delivery was weighed, inspected, and assigned to a batch. Fresh young leaves went to the premium vats. Mature leaves went to lighter-grade production. Anything wilted was rejected. Nothing was mixed without a record. By noon, the barn was full. The new equipment had not arrived yet, so the cooperative still worked with small vats and 1 repaired pump. Mara moved from batch to batch with a clipboard. Ruth checked the cloth samples. Lena inspected the wool and denim tests. Daniel's chemist sealed a sample from every vat. Near midnight, 1 batch began to overheat. The foam darkened. Mara recognized the smell. "Stop the air." Ben shut down the pump. Ruth opened the cooling line. They divided the liquid into 2 smaller vats. Months earlier, Mara would have lost the entire batch. This time, the temperature dropped before the color collapsed. At 3 in the morning, the first roll of denim came out of the vat. It looked yellow-green. The growers carried it outside. Air moved across the wet fabric. Green became turquoise. Then blue spread through the folds. Another roll followed. Then another. The yard filled with indigo. Amos removed his cap. Rosa's youngest son reached toward the fabric, then stopped before touching it. No one spoke until the chemist began cutting test samples. The results came several hours later. Wash resistance passed. Color transfer passed. The darkest lot met the premium range. 1 corrected batch came out lighter than planned. Mara looked at Daniel. "Rejected?" He shook his head. "Reclassified. The lighter denim would become part of a separate limited line." The system had done what Mara promised. It had turned variation into traceable products instead of unexplained failure. Daniel handed her the final approval. "The investment is released." The first truck was loaded that afternoon. Every roll carried a code linking it to a farm, harvest time, and vat. Mara signed the shipping papers on the hood of her father's old pickup. With the laboratory approval, the contracts became active. The official valuation of the company crossed $1 million. Grant Holloway arrived as the truck doors were closing. He looked at the denim, the company vehicles, and the farmers gathered beside the scale. "How much did they buy?" he asked. "Enough," Mara said. "I could plant 20 acres next season." Weeks earlier, he had called the crop worthless. Now he wanted access to the market built around it. Mara handed him a copy of the grower standards. "You can apply to the cooperative." Grant looked at the paper. "Apply? The council approves new farms. You need my acreage." "No," Mara said. "You need our contract." The truck pulled away. Grant remained beside the gate, holding the application. Ruth joined Mara. "You built $1 million company," she said. Mara watched the truck disappear down the road. Not from one harvest. No, from knowing what to do with it. The leaves had become dye. The dye had become a product. The product had become a network. And the network had become something large enough that the people who once dismissed it now wanted to join. Behind them, another roll of white denim waited beside the vats. The first commercial harvest was complete. The business had only begun. By the next harvest season, the old barn was no longer large enough. A new processing building stood beside it with sealed floors, stainless steel vats, and a small testing room. The original barrels remained against one wall. Mara kept them there on purpose. One had produced her first stable batch. Another still carried the stain from the night the large tank collapsed. The cooperative had grown from 5 farms to 23. Every field had a code. Every delivery carried a harvest time. Every batch could be traced from leaf to fabric. The system was larger now, but the rules had not changed. Cut early, keep the leaves cool, separate each field, control the air, record everything. Before sunrise, the first trucks began arriving. Amos Reed delivered from the field he once planned to abandon. Rosa Delgado brought 2 labeled loads with her sons. Ben Carter arrived 35 minutes after cutting. Mara inspected his leaves. Fresh, cool, accepted. Ben smiled. "I'm getting better at this. You're getting faster." That too. The yard filled with workers, baskets, and blue cloth drying in the morning air. Then Grant Holloway's truck entered the gate. He stepped out carrying a binder. Mara met him beside the loading station. "What is that?" she asked. "My application." Inside were field maps, water records, and a planting plan for 20 acres. Mara turned the pages. "You tested a small plot?" "Half an acre." "You marked the shaded sections?" "Yes." "You can deliver within 1 hour?" Grant nodded. Mara closed the binder. "The council meets this afternoon. I thought you could approve it. I don't approve growers alone." Grant looked toward the farmers unloading their crops. Several had once depended on his equipment, his contracts, or his prices. Now they would decide whether he could join. "You planned this," he said. "No. You knew I would come back. I knew you would come back if the numbers worked." Grant looked toward the processing building. "They work. They didn't when you called the crop worthless." He was silent. Then he said, "I was wrong." Mara waited. Grant glanced toward the vats. "I thought the value was in the land. Then I thought it was in the plant. And now? Now I know it is in the system." Mara handed the binder back. "The council will review it." That afternoon, Grant was approved for 5 trial acres, not 20. He disliked the decision, but he signed the agreement. As he left, he stopped beside Mara's old pickup. "You could replace that truck now. It still runs. You can afford a new one." "That doesn't mean I need one." Grant looked at the blue stains along the truck bed. "I thought you had lost your mind when you brought those leaves to the cooperative." "I nearly had." He gave a small smile and drove away with seed for 5 acres. Later, a school group arrived for a farm tour. Each child carried a square of white cotton. Mara led them to a demonstration vat. A girl raised her hand. "Why are the plants green if they make blue?" "The blue isn't visible yet," Mara said. "Then where is it?" "Inside something the leaf has not become." Mara lowered a strip of cloth into the vat. It came out yellow-green. The children looked disappointed. Then she carried it outside. Air touched the fabric. Green became turquoise. Turquoise became blue. The children moved closer. One boy pointed at the cloth. "Did the air paint it?" "The air helped finish it." The children dyed their own squares. No 2 came out the same. Some were pale. Some had dark folds. None were perfect. The children did not call them defective. They called them theirs. After the tour, Mara returned to the old barn. The sample wall was still there. Failures on the left. Stable shades on the right. The darkest north wall cloth in the center. Ruth stood beside Evelyn's notebook. "Still keeping the ugly ones?" she asked. "They show what changed." Ruth opened to the familiar line. "The leaf holds no blue until you teach it how to breathe." Outside, workers lifted another roll of fabric from the vat. Mara and Ruth followed. The cloth emerged yellow-green, then the air turned it blue. A child who had stayed behind watched from the edge of the yard. "Ms. Ellison?" Mara turned. "Were those people lying when they said your crop was worthless?" "No," Mara said. "They believed it. Then why were they wrong?" Mara looked across the fields. From a distance, the plants still looked ordinary. "They only knew how to value what the crop already was," she said. "They never asked what it could become." The girl looked at the blue cloth. Mara wiped her hands on her apron. The stains no longer marked failure. They appeared on every shipment leaving the farm. 2 blue hands. Beneath them were the words, "Grown by people who looked twice." At sunset, the last truck left the yard. Mara walked alone to the shaded row near the north wall. She crushed one leaf between her fingers. The pulp looked green, then gray, then blue. One season earlier, that small stain had been her only proof. Now the same color supported 23 farms. Mara looked across the field. The crop had never been worthless. They had simply been asking it to become the wrong product.